You're listening to the Be Better Off Show by Kelly+Partners.
Welcome to the Be Better Off Show, where we interview interesting Australians and some amazing people from around the world in terms of how to be better off, which means being healthier, wealthier and wiser. Today's very special guest, John Brogden, who's had an illustrious career in public service, including being the leader of the opposition in New South Wales. Welcome, John.
Mate, how are you?
Yeah, really great. Really
Excellent.
Beautiful morning here in Sydney. It doesn't know whether it wants to be summer or winter, but there it is.
That's right, that's called spring.
Yep, middle of the pandemic. Now, John, let's start from the beginning. Where did you grow up, and what were the formative experiences, I guess, in your family and education that set you on a path to the career that you undertook?
Mate, so look, I was born in Balmain in 1969, Balmain Hospital. The last time the Tigers won the grand final before they became the West Tigers. I was the second of three children. My sister was only 15 months older than me, and my brother is 3 years younger. Mum was a secretary, later a school secretary, then a doctor's secretary, and Dad was a carpenter. Dad came out from New Zealand in 1960 to stay for 6 months, and here we are 60 years later, and he's still here. Mum was a Balmain girl as well, one of 9 children, 6 girls and 3 boys. And my grandmother was a very, very influential part of my life. She lived in Balmain all her life except for the last 5 years when she had dementia and was in a nursing home. When I was 4, we moved to Haberfield. The house was getting too small when my brother arrived, and we moved to Haberfield. 206 Alt Street, Haberfield. Walked up the hill to go to school to St Joan of Arc at Haberfield from kindergarten to year 4. And as you might remember, Brett, in the old days, the Catholic system meant that all the boys had to leave at the end of year 4, and year 5 and 6 at the local parochial school was just the girls. And I started in St Patrick's at Strathfield in year 5 and went through there to year 12. And I had a wonderful experience at St Patrick's. I was able to be the vice captain of the school. I wasn't the captain. I've never quite got over the fact, Brett, that I was never the captain at school. But it was a wonderful experience. And we were educated by the Christian Brothers, and I appreciate that there were some terrible activities undertaken by the Christian Brothers that really did destroy the lives of a number of young men. But I can say from my experience, it was a very positive experience, a really positive experience. For me, growing up was almost two worlds, Brett. It was the sort of turn up at school and, shoe shine and garters on and be very, very involved. I mean, I loved my school. I was full of school spirit, and school was not only a great place for me, but a refuge for me, because home was very difficult. Mum and Dad got divorced when I was 13. They'd never had a good marriage. And then, unfortunately, Mum brought into the house a man who was an alcoholic and, as we later discovered, would abuse her as well, would hit her, and being a complete coward, he'd hit her in places that she could hide with clothing. So it was something that only became known to us as time came on. Yeah. And that was a very difficult time for us, and we'd often leave home, stay at Nan's for 2 weeks or stay somewhere for a week and then come back and move in and move out. So it was very disruptive. So I lived this sort of, home was a nightmare, but school was my great saviour. And finally I moved out, and when things just got too hard to deal with, and I moved in with my grandmother in Balmain, and she was good old-fashioned Balmain working class. I joined the Liberal Party.
Mother of 9 children.
Yeah, mother of 9.
So tough get up and go type of.
Oh no, she ran. I'm told she ran it like a military camp. That house, 20 Jane Street, Balmain. She ran a tough house. But to grandchildren, of course, as we all experience, grandparents are usually much softer with their grandchildren. Yes. So she had about 35 grandchildren, of which I was one. And I moved in to live with her, and she was just a wonderful influence in my life, other than being a very calming influence. But she was also, from a hard-working life. She used to say, I never had a job in my life. This is a great line, Brett. I never had a job in my life, but I worked every day of my life. Yeah. And I always thought that, and when you've got 9 kids, you do work every day of your life. And
absolutely.
The great pride for her, the greatest pride in her life was owning your own home. That was the greatest achievement of the working class, was to own your own home. I loved living with her. She was very loving and caring and good fun, and full of all these sort of anecdotes from life and all these great sayings. But I joined the Liberal Party when I was 17, and I went and told her that. And she said, oh, that's all right, dear. That's a passing phase you'll go through. Of course, the whole family ever only voted Liberal. Labor, I was the black sheep of the family. And Auntie Kate, who lived right next door to Nan, that was my grandfather's, my then late grandfather's cousin. Auntie Kate cried when I told her I'd join the Liberal. So it was a very important path for me. And I'd become very interested in politics when I was at school. I remember probably what a dag I was, but every morning I'd buy the Sydney Morning Herald, 30 cents.
Yep.
And on Wednesdays, I'd buy the Bulletin, another 70 cents for $1. I remember that very well. And I'd read the Herald every day. And that just opened my eyes to a greater world. We never talked politics at home. It was a non-political family. So it's not like I was brought up in an environment or an atmosphere. I just became interested myself. And that led me to join the Young Liberals. So I joined the Young Liberals, as I said, when I was 17. And of course, back then, Brett, you're slightly old enough to remember, there's no internet, school kids don't have mobile phones. So how do you join a political party? So I decided, living in Haberfield, that I'd go to Ashfield Council on a Tuesday night meeting. Worked out they met on Tuesday nights, went up to Ashfield Council, sat through a 3-hour meeting of Ashfield Council in my St Patrick's School uniform. And then at the end, I walked up to the mayor and I said, "Oh, hello, Mr. Mayor. My name's John Brogden. I'd like to join the Liberal Party." Yep.
So you then, as a young Liberal, I guess have that heady experience of working with people who are in government, because in politics, if you're not in government, it's something like being at the beach. You get to see a lot of things happen, but you don't get to do much.
Yeah, good description.
I think it's really interesting. So how did that shape you, I guess?
So I had a very poor HSC as a consequence of all of this terrible stuff happening at home. So I didn't get the marks I wanted, but I did get the opportunity to go into teaching. And I trained as a primary school teacher, and it was a 3-year course at that stage, and I was doing okay. But then my political interest grew and grew and grew. As you said, the Libs won in 88. And in 89, I was offered a job to go and work for a politician. And that was Ted Pickering, who at that stage was the police minister, police and emergency services, and the leader of the government and leadership council. And I had this fantastic opportunity to spend all this time around men and women who I'm now the same age as. Back then, they were titans of, they'd been in opposition, they'd won, they were senior ministers, cars and drivers and people, yes minister, no minister, all that sort of stuff. And here I am at fundamentally 20 years old, walking in the door to all of this. And I learnt a lot of lessons and a lot of leadership traits. And much of my experience in life, Brett, has not been being sat down and told this is how we do it or this is a good idea. It's actually just observing.
Yep.
And I worked all this out when Lucy and I started having children. And you realise it's what you do that they watch. It's not what you say. It's what you do.
Absolutely.
And I realised watching these men, and Ted Pickering, lovely bloke, and I learned a great lesson in leadership. So I used to have a job of clearing his correspondence. And in those days, he would go home with 2 or 3 large Globite suitcases of letters to sign every day. And it had ranged from people trying to get off a parking fine to people with serious matters that they were bringing to his attention, policy matters and the like. And I used to divide the correspondence into 2 piles. The stuff that I'd read was very straightforward. He could just sign it like, "Dear Mr. Kelly, your application for your overturning of your fine's been
approved,
been approved or not approved." So that he could just sign them. And then the ones he had to read. So I literally would tie these up in pink tape, red tape, in the old legal pink tape, and put them in the case. Anyway, you go through hundreds of letters a week, and sometimes I guess you lose a bit of focus. So off goes a whole lot of letters. 2 weeks later, front page of the Penrith Star newspaper in Western Sydney is effectively a story based on a letter that I let the minister sign. It was a letter that basically said, incredibly factually, you live in a lower income area, so put up with higher crime. So that Penrith Star ran this story big. It was a nightmare. Ted was being asked questions in Parliament, and Parliament sat Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We got to the end of the week, and I was just dying. Here I am. It's all my fault. I let him sign the letter. So he called me in, Brett, on the Thursday afternoon, and I walked in and I thought, I'm going to be sacked. Right? I walked in, and he was visibly shaken through this week of all this stuff going on, and he turned to me and he said, "John, please don't do that again." And that was it. And I thought, what a great gift in leadership. He survived. He could have sacked me. I would have gone, it was my fault. That could have been a great leadership lesson. But it was a better lesson in that he said, he sucked it all up. He took all the pressure. He was the boss. I was a young bloke. I was still learning. And he said, please don't do that again. And I've never forgotten that. And I've used it in my career.
Yep.
I had the great pleasure of then working for John Fay, Brett. He was at that stage the Minister for Industrial Relations, and then went on to be Premier when I was working for him, and just passed away very recently. He taught me another lesson. Once again, he didn't teach me this. I just watched it happen. He would introduce all his staff, bearing in mind at that stage I'm 22 years old, all his staff, including me, you'd walk into a meeting, here's the minister, you're nobody at 22 years old, and he'd introduce you this way. He would say, oh, hello, Brett, this is John who works with me, not for me, with me. And I can't, I mean, that was better than a pay rise, mate. I mean, the respect that showed, the genuine nature of it, that he was investing in you so much that he said, you work with me. You felt 20 foot tall. It was an incredible thing. And he just did it without blinking. And he did it with all his staff. That's another.
And they're very interesting men, you know, when you look back, because I think John died last week. There was some really great coverage of him. Yeah, and he'd had a very interesting life. He'd studied in the seminary to be a priest. He'd then studied law. He'd had a big career before he came to Parliament. And so for a young person to have the opportunity to work closely with people of real accomplishment and real capacity, I think you're right. You do learn from what people show you rather than what they tell you. So I
also learned, Brett, what hard work is all about. I mean, you know, taking home 2 old-fashioned Globite cases, not the school ones, every night, and everything came back the next morning signed. John Fay would come up. He lived in Bowral, so he'd come up and stay overnight when Parliament was sitting, and he'd sit there till 2 or 3 in the morning doing his papers. And it was another great thing to learn. And nobody ever sat down and said, you've got to work hard, son. You just watch it and you think, well, that's how you become successful. So it was all
Well, that's interesting. It's very interesting because a lot of young people who will say to me, you know I need to work hard, but they've never seen it. The habits that they have and the ideas that they have are just from their own experience. And so as a young guy growing up in Balmain, shifting between homes, if you just work like your father or your dad or some of the men that you'd seen, it would have been one example, but then to see these other men and women and their work ethic and their values. I say to everyone, if you will end up the average of the people that you spend your time with.
Yeah, great line.
And so if you can get better people around you, you learn by their high standards.
It can often be the little things that really matter. And I was working for Ted Pickering and he said, John, take this up to the Premier. And I thought, oh my God, I've never been in the Premier's office. And so I walk along the corridor at Parliament House and walked up to the reception and said, oh, look, can you give this to the Premier, please? It's from Mr. Pickering. And she said, no, you take it in, John. You take it in. I thought, oh, my God. So I walk in and it was a funny desk. It's still the same in Parliament House in Sydney. But you walk into the door and the Premier's working at his desk looking forward. So you walk, he's at the back of you. Sorry, his back is facing you as you walk in. So I walked in and I said, oh, Premier, this is from Mr. Pickering. And he said, oh, thank you, John. John, call me by my first name, Brett. I almost collapsed. Wow, he knows my first name. And he could have said thank you. He could have said thank you, mate. He could have said thank you. He could have grunted. He could have done anything, but he said thank you, John. And here I am 30 years later, and I can remember that like it happened this morning. So
it's very, very interesting.
Little lessons, you know.
So you become a member of Parliament. How did that progression from staffer? Which seat did you stand in? How did you get the confidence to put yourself out there in that very public way?
It's interesting, Brett. You know, I look back at all of this part of my career and I have 2 strong reflections. The first one is I must have been able to walk a reasonably fine line between phenomenal self-confidence and arrogance. And I know sometimes I cross that line the wrong way, but to be able to say to yourself at 21, that I want to run for Parliament, which is what I first started doing, I look back now and I think, wow, not about me, but wow, what did it take to think you could do that? And the other thing is, I often, in my current life, in my current role as the CEO, you know, you're talking to somebody and, how old are you? And they say, oh, I'm 26 or something. Well, 27 is the best age because that's the age I got into Parliament. And many will think, geez, you're young. And I'll think, no, I was in Parliament at that age and I'll give you a crack. I'll give you a go. And we were all 27 once. You know, we were all 25 once. We were all starting a job once. So I was in Drummoyne Young Liberals at that stage. That was the local Young Liberal branch. And pre-selection came up for the state seat of Drummoyne, which was a Labor seat at that stage. And I put my hand up for pre-selection. Nick Ryder was the Premier and famously said, it's an effing joke for a 21-year-old to run for Parliament. And my 2 great advocates that calmed him down were Bruce Baird and John Fay, which was, well, once again, how generous of these 2 men. So I ran for the pre-selection and I lost it. Lucy and I got married. We moved to Bondi just to live somewhere that was very different to both of us.
Yep.
Love living at Bondi. The seat of Vaucluse came up in 1994. I ran for that pre-selection. I lost it by 5 votes. And then the seat of Pittwater came up. And at that stage, Lucy and I had started the trend, Brett, of living in the city. So,
Yep.
one of the old wool stores in Piermont was restored and we bought an apartment there. And then the seat of Pittwater came up. And for your non-Sydney listeners, Pittwater is where they film Home and Away. So
an hour north of Sydney.
Yeah, that's right. Basically, Palm Beach is the top of the seat. So I put my hand up for this. And a few of us had a meeting what we used to all do as young Liberals is get together to help each other's careers. So it was people then like Joe Hockey and Maurice Payne and Don Harwin, who's a minister, a handful of us would get together and we'd all help each other. We'd all do the numbers and often, we'd do speech, we'd all write the speech together and we'd test each other with questions. It was a real sort of training ground. And all of them said, "You're a bloody idiot running for Pittwater, you won't win. What are you wasting your time?" I said, "No, I'm going to give it a go." So I ran for the seat at Pittwater. It was after the Libs had lost in 95. The sitting member had retired a year later. So this is March, April 1996. And I ran for the seat and I came second. And another great lesson in leadership, I hesitate only because it was something that I thought of and I did. So I'm trying not to boast too much. But I came second and it was a large field and they selected another bloke who hadn't been a long-term Liberal Party member. So there was this sort of test between a Liberal who wasn't a local at the end versus a local who wasn't a Liberal. So they went for the local, and that's fine. And I remember ringing him the next day and saying, "Oh, look, mate, congratulations, good on you. If I can help in any way, if I can join your campaign committee in any way." He then, the next 2 weeks, there was a bit of public controversy around what he'd said and done in the past, and he resigned as the candidate, and I replaced him. And the lesson there, and I always give this to young people, particularly in politics and also in business, is if you lose an opportunity for promotion, don't bitch and whinge to everybody about it. Suck it up, and offer the winner your support. Yeah. Because if I had spent the last 2 weeks, Brett, publicly whinging and bitching about this bloke around the Liberal Party, I wouldn't have been seen as a team player.
I had a situation yesterday just in the business where I gave a piece of business to someone else rather than the other person. The other person lost their mind and really carried on quite immaturely. And what it meant was that the opportunity that I had to do the next thing, which I wanted to give to that person, I now can't give to them because of the way they behaved. And then, I've got this saying that, I played a lot of sport. You really know who somebody is when the ball doesn't bounce their way, and if you've played enough, I played a lot of cricket, and what I loved about cricket pre the electronic, what you see at the professional level is, sometimes you get given out when you're not out.
Sure.
Sometimes you get given out when you run out, when you're not run out, when you're not LBW or you didn't nick it. But it's very character forming to understand that, well, how you react in that situation is really important.
You're right. And my beloved grandmother, my beautiful grandmother, used to say, "John, look after people on the way up the ladder because you might need them on the way down." Yeah. And I thought, that's right. So you've got to keep your eye on the main game, Brett, because the main game is, if you're ambitious, the main game's up here. And if you get hurt down here, there's a great saying I've learned in recent years, which is the comeback beats the fallback. It's how you react to these situations. I often get asked by people, what's your great lesson in leadership and what's your great experience? I said, failure.
It teaches you everything.
Yeah. Richard Nixon, who left office in disgrace on the 9th of August 1974, gave this rambling speech as he left the White House. And it's on YouTube. I encourage people to go and find it. Nixon resignation speech. And it was a long rambling speech, but towards the end, there's just this magnificent nugget, not a scripted note in his hand. And he says, "It's not until you've stood in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to stand on the highest mountain." And that was his career, because he had lots of failures on the way through to success. And then ultimately, incredibly, the only president ever to have resigned from office in scandal. So, but it is right. You need, unless you've had a few failures along the way. And I know with your clients, Brett, with you, there are some lucky buggers who get hit in the backside by a rainbow for their entire life. But by and large, people have setbacks along the way. And it's how you analyse the setback. It's how you recover from it. It's how you think about it. Now, some poor people have multiple setbacks and, physical health, mental health, personal business, and they do it very tough, and that's a different story. But for most of us, thankfully, we live a life where we have a few setbacks along the way. And if you give up early, well, you live a long time. You live a long time.
Yeah.
And it's what you learn from your failures. I mean, obviously, we hope we don't make the same mistake again, but it's what you learn, and it's particularly what you learn about yourself.
Yep.
I think that's really critical, because if you fail and it's everybody else's fault, it's highly unlikely that it's everybody else's fault. It's highly likely you played some role, if not the major role. So it's what you learn about yourself.
Which is really interesting.
And how you change. And you do need to change.
Get into this, you win this seat. You're 27 years old.
27.
You're now representing an area that you're not a local to, so you don't have deep sort of history and community ties. Now, how long did you end up being the member for Pittwater?
So I went in 96 in a by-election. Most politicians, Brett, who go in a by-election feel very nervous until they win a general election in their own right. It's a bit like, I'm not legitimised until I win it in my own right. So we had a general election in 99. I won the seat comfortably. I really just began growing very deep roots and turned up to everything, up to everything and enjoyed it. And look,
beautiful part of the world too.
Oh, it is,
that helps.
and lovely people. and people often say to you, gee, how did you put up with all those rubber chicken dinners, the RSL clubs and all that sort of stuff? And Lucy and I loved them, strangely enough, because you get to sit next to incredible people. So you turn up and you'd sit next to this person you've never met before. And I'll never forget, we went out when I was leader of the opposition later, and you're doing more stuff around the state. And I went out to a dinner for a charity thing somewhere in Western Sydney, and sat next to this husband and wife on the head table, and they had fostered something like 40 children over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So you learn all this fantastic stuff, and you learn hopefully to shut up from talking to yourself and listen to them. And you just had these experiences everywhere. Veterans who'd gone to war who share stories with you. The old men and women, people who tell you about their successes and their failures and ask you for help. I had a bloke come in, and I knew this bloke from the community. Came into my electorate office, and he said, "Now, John, I don't vote for you." I said, "Yeah, no, I know you don't vote for me." No, John, I don't vote for you." I said, "I know, I've never voted." "Okay, John, right out. I get it, right out, you don't vote for me." And he told me this story. He had two sons, very close in age, very similar looking. And one of them had gone down this terrible spiral to heroin addiction and ultimately death. It was just so sad. But down on the spiral, he had been able to give his brother's identity when he was charged with crimes. So you had this situation where one son was dead, the other one was alive with a whole lot of crimes against his name, none of which he committed. Bizarre concept, but this happened. So you'll be pleased to know, Brett, that one of the hardest things to do is to expunge somebody's criminal record. It's incredibly hard to do. So I was able to take this case to the Attorney General, Labor guy, Bob Davis, lovely man, took it to him, talked about it, and he expunged the record. And, I'm not telling you who that was, but the satisfaction and for me to know that I'd actually helped somebody cut through all that red tape and help somebody get their life back on track who was very unfairly holding a criminal record. So that was a great achievement. You felt like a parish priest, you could help somebody directly. And so I enjoyed that part of the job. I was re-elected, as I said, in 99, 4-year terms. So then the next election was 2003. And we had lost a lot of seats in 1999 and gone backwards into opposition.
Who was the leader in 99?
Kerry Chikarovsky had become leader. She'd rolled Peter Collins right before the election.
So that was that drama-filled era.
Yeah, and thankfully I'm friends with both of them today. But Kerry lost badly, and she never really recovered politically. She was a hard worker. But it got to that point, as it often does in jobs and in politics and the like, where it didn't matter what you did, you were never going to recover. That people had well and truly marked you off and marked you down. So I challenged for the leadership, and I was 32 years old. I challenged her for the leadership, and I'd done a lot of thinking about it, and I pulled my alliance of numbers together that I thought would get me across the line. And I walked into her on a Monday afternoon and said, I'm challenging you for the leadership, Kerry. I'd like you to resign, and I will run for the leadership. And to her credit, she said, I'm not resigning. You're going to have to beat me at a ballot. I said, okay. So she chose the date of the ballot because she was the leader. And by great coincidence, Brett, she chose my birthday.
I was
my
going to say, she chose your birthday.
She chose my birthday, 28th of March 2002, which was my 33rd birthday, and Easter Thursday. And we came in for the ballot. Everybody thought I was going to lose. All the commentary in the media was that I was going to lose. Kerry and her supporters thought they had the numbers. And the numbers arrived and I won 15 votes to 14. Now, when you win the leadership, you can win by one vote. When you're defending the leadership, you've got to win by a decent margin. So although it was one vote, Neville Rand got elected to the leadership of the Labor Party in 1973 by one vote. So there's a bit of history there. So I had one vote and there I was. I was the leader. And lovely media then and over the Easter weekend, and got to Tuesday. And we said to Kerry, keep the car and driver for the Easter, and, you know, we don't need to be in the office. She said, oh, no, I'll clean it out by Tuesday. So we had an agreed time to meet on Tuesday. And I walked into her office and she was there. She was incredibly graceful. And she said, well, John, good luck. And here's the office. Now, imagine walking into an office. Now that building had been there for 30 years, but it was like it was brand new. There wasn't a pencil, there wasn't a pen, there was nothing in the office. So when they cleaned it out, they cleaned it out.
Good luck.
And as she walked out and she closed the door behind herself, Brett, and it's quite a large office, sort of befitting of a senior politician in those days, quite a large office. And she closed the door and there wasn't a painting on it, there was nothing, not a painting on the wall. And I remember thinking, now I understand what it means when people say it's lonely at the top. Because here I am in this office with views of Sydney Harbour, but I'm by myself. I am by myself. Yeah. And this is the place where ultimately you make the decision.
Yeah.
You can, and I tried my best to consult widely, and it's been a skill I hope I've developed over the years, to consult widely with my staff and my fellow members of Parliament and shadow ministers and the like. But ultimately, you've got to make the call.
Yeah. So you get that role, headed into election in 2007.
2003 was the first one.
Oh, okay. So you've got the leadership in March 2002.
So we had the 2003 election, which I lost. Up against Bob Carr. At the height of his powers, Brett. Just after a couple of years after the Olympics, which was, as we're now celebrating 20 years on, stunning success. Very strong political dominance, great support by the media in New South Wales at that stage, a very polished player. Yeah. And I always thought I'll lose one and win the next. My view was, and John Howard lost one and won the next. Nick Grinder lost one and won the next. There's a great history of
because it takes time for people to. It's interesting on reflection. Sure. It takes time for people to get to know a person and take a view, and it also, it's almost like the electorate want to see how somebody cops a loss to see whether they're worthy of a victory.
Correct. And
the way the Australian electorate is.
Right? So I was very young. I didn't think I was young, but I thought I was ready for the job. So we basically went in and came out with a net zero. There was barely a change in number. There's no change in numbers. Liberal Party. We won one seat and lost one seat. The election campaign gave me exactly what you were talking about, Brett, which is coverage, massive coverage. So I had all this coverage. And I remember on the Friday before the Saturday of the campaign, I was at a function and Wendy Harmer, who's a journalist now in Sydney, leaned across to me and said, John, you're not going to win this one, but you'll win the next one. And what I hoped for was that we'd get halfway there. We'd win 5 or 8 seats and get halfway to winning. But I got nowhere to winning. And I thought, no, she wasn't joking. She was right. They all basically said, listen, young man, we're not going to punish you. We're not going to reward you. We're going to give you another 4 years and see how you go. Yeah. And so I then decided that as hard as I'd worked beforehand, because when I won the leadership, Brett, I looked around the room and imagine being the youngest person in the company running the company. By
probably a decade.
Well, close
on average.
Oh, easy. And there were people in that room, Brett, who were old enough to be my father. Yeah. And I was their boss. Yeah. So I thought, what do you do? And I thought, I'm going to work hard. There was a great rule that the Royal Navy had during the height of the British Empire, which is the Royal Navy was always bigger than the combined second and third navies in the world. That was their rule. Whatever they've got will be bigger than the... And I thought, I'm going to work harder than the 2 hardest working people in this room. That's going to be my benchmark. So I worked hard up to the election, and then I lost the election. And where most people say, okay, I'll take a break or I'll slow it down and, then we'll gear it up. I said, no, we've got to work harder. We've got 4 years. It's a fixed 4-year term, 2 years opposing and 2 years proposing. So the first 2 years is about dragging the government down, and then we switch gears and we start proposing our policy over that period of time. So I kept that discipline. We'd have meetings of the shadow cabinet. People say, well, we've got to get this policy. I said, no, not now. We've got a clear two-year, two-half strategy. Let's stick to the strategy. We were doing okay. We came very close on a few polls against Labor, the published polls. They don't publish them now the way they used to. They were out every other month. I think we got ahead of them or equal to them on a few occasions. So we were doing okay. And I could see it moving the right way. And then Bob Carr, when you look back, it was pretty predictable, but after he'd done 10 years as Premier. But at that time, people thought he'd keep going. But came out of the blue, came to work on a Monday morning, called a press conference to say, I'm retiring. And it was big news. Brett, I saw the gates of heaven open up to me. I thought sometimes when a long-term leader goes, the next one who comes in who's a bit new, not well-known, but you are well-known and you are battle-hardened, you're ready to go.
Yeah.
So within a few weeks, I'd resigned the leadership. I went to a cocktail party held by one of the industry associations. I wasn't drunk. People assume I was drunk, and this is all public. I wasn't drunk. I was just probably too exuberant as a consequence of, the gates have opened up.
Yeah.
And I said and did a few things that ended up in the media that were stupid and inappropriate and unprofessional. And they all then came out a few weeks later in the media, and I resigned the leadership. I resigned quickly.
What year was that?
That's 2005.
2005. So it's very interesting, John. I've always wanted to ask you, I observed what happened then. There's an amazing Netflix show at the moment called Trumped. And yeah, it's incredible on how Trump, changed the political calculus on winning. And, it's not done by anyone sympathetic, but there's some real insight in it. And there's a time in his campaign against Hillary Clinton where all the allegations about grabbing women and whatnot came out. And he stared it down. He apologised. He said he was sorry, that it didn't reflect who he is today and that he shouldn't have said it then. And it was, locker room talk, but not appropriate. And he was genuinely sincere as, on his range of communication ability. The media went absolutely batshit crazy, basically. And 5 days later, there's a very high rating television show, and the host of that show in this special says, that would have sunk any mere mortal, but it didn't. Yeah. And she said, I think it was a woman, and she said, when that happened, we knew that he was different. Now, I often looked at that situation and thought, well, do you ever look back and say, if I'd made a sort of full and frank confession, that there was any path through that? Or do you think that you'd worked so hard that you hadn't had time, and the bubble of politics is better understood now than I think it was then, but so hard for so long, sort of in that bubble, that you didn't feel stepping back and reflecting and that there was any other course of action that you could have taken?
So I remember on that morning, it was a Monday morning, that I was heading in to do a press conference, and it was clear it was likely I was going to resign, and I think word had got out that I was going to resign. Sorry, no, word hadn't got out, actually. And I remember arriving at Parliament House, and the deputy leader of the National Party, beautiful man, Don Page, who'd always been a great friendly man, even a mentor, to be honest, and I'd known Don for a long time. And Don came down to my head. They're on level 12. They came down to level 10, and he almost knocked open the door. He said, John, don't resign. Do not resign. Do not resign, John. We're behind you. We'll back you all up. Do not resign. And then I got a phone call from the Liberal Party whip, who was the member for Wagga. And he was down in Wagga, and he didn't need the telephone. He was shouting so loudly at me, don't you bloody resign. Don't you go anywhere. You stay where you are. John, you do not resign. So I didn't have people banging on my door saying, you've got to resign in the party.
That's very interesting. It's so interesting to know, because I never thought you should have resigned. But there you go.
Well, so here's my answer to your question. If it was you, Brett, if you were in my shoes, Brett, I could have advised you how to stay.
Absolutely.
So I could have written the plan. I could have written the plan. I could have advised you. I would have, if I was in Parliament, I would have protected your back. I would have spoken to that journo. But for me, because I have depression and suicidal ideation, for me, everything catastrophized very quickly. Yeah. And when things catastrophise for me, or particularly back then.
But did you know that at the time? Did you know you had that condition?
Well, no, I didn't. But what I did know was this, and I've really only reflected on this in the last year. I turned 50 last year, and people say it doesn't matter. It does matter in the sense that it does become a reflective time, and you've probably got less on the earth than you've already spent. You've certainly got less in your full-time working career, so you do begin to think about later in life. But I was reflecting backwards, and I realised when all that stuff was happening home, and all that yelling and screaming and fighting and alcohol, when all that was happening, in my mind, I always thought, if things get too bad, I'll kill myself. I'll take my own life. And that was always my plan Z, I guess you'd say.
Plan Z, yeah.
And it was always in my mind. So I literally medically have an illness called suicidal ideation. Yeah. And it rears up when everything goes wrong. In my mind, everything goes wrong. Usually a big or high profile thing goes wrong. And it's interesting, in my business career since, people can attack the organisation I run every day of the week, and I'll get out there and defend it. Got no problems with that. And I don't lose a wink of sleep over that without sounding arrogant. If they attack me personally, I find that hard to take. And that's when the depression kicks in and the suicidal ideation.
So interesting. That's so,
So I could have written the story for you.
That.
I could have written the strategy. Yeah. People would say to me, I remember having friends call me in and say, John, no, don't resign. Afterwards, after I got out of hospital, they'd say, no, John, stay, or run for the leadership again. I mean, people were incredible because, so let me share, this is, you look back saying, I don't know why you resigned, but, and I know the manner in which you say it. It's a generous way in which you say it.
I think, and that's why I raised the Trump comment. I think, he said, in a way, what I think a lot of people believe, which is that people make mistakes. Yeah. They say and do things they shouldn't do. The problem with them is if they dress it up as if it isn't a mistake or it isn't something that they shouldn't say or do, or that they don't accept that they did. And
I very openly admitted. Yeah,
that's right. And so he sort of took this calculus that if I stand up and say I did the wrong thing, it was indefensible. It's not reflective of who I am, at least most of the time. But and I'm sure. He was essentially backing that most people have said or done something that they think they should have said or done at some point. And so people are, I've got a huge respect for the electorate, if you like, the common person and the group of people that make up Australia, to know that they've got common sense, that they're not judgmental, that they are quite a sympathetic and wise group in many ways.
And my electorate came out in extraordinary support for me. The people at Pittwater and the then Deputy Mayor, one of the silly things I did is pinch a female journo on the backside who I'd known for a long, long time, and it wasn't sexual, it was silly. It wasn't sexual. Anyway, the Deputy Mayor of Pittwater said to the local paper, he can pinch my bum anytime. Yeah. And people were just wonderful. And, nobody wanted me to resign. But
so you discover through that, I guess, a better understanding of yourself. On reflection, if you'd known yourself better as a younger person, would you have put yourself in that position?
Yeah. So,
given the personal nature, that the way politics has become much more personality and personally focused.
Well, it's interesting that I think the media were out of step with the public at that time. So the media decided to keep going even after I'd resigned as the leader. And so the day after that, I got a phone call in the evening from my media guy, Lance. And Lance said, John, it was around 6 o'clock, John, this is what the Telegraph's going to run tomorrow. And they were going to run all this stuff without even seeking my comment. And it was all personal stuff, and it was all twisted. So it was sort of, you said this to that person. And at that point, immediately, I remember exactly where I was standing in my home. We still live in that home. And I said, that's it, it's all over. The blood's in the water. I need to kill myself because I've put so much shame on my wife, Lucy, my friends, my family, my supporters. I can't wade into this mud and fix it up because the die is cast. I can't say, no, I didn't say that. I said this, I didn't say that. And they didn't care. The paper didn't care. So I took myself off and tried to take my own life. I rang a friend of mine who is a priest, and said, oh, look, I want to make my confession. And he said, John, the Vatican hasn't caught up with mobile phones. I can't do it over the phone. So I went to my local parish and knocked on the door, and my priest took my confession. They went off and tried to kill myself. And Brett, I thank God every day that I didn't complete my suicide. I thank God that I was followed by others. The police were called and they prevented me halfway through. And we received, in the weeks and months that followed that, Lucy and I received emails, faxes, letters, cards from 10,000 people, most of whom I'd never met in my life, saying, listen, my brother, my sister, whatever, took their own life or tried to. And, they were all, 100% of them were supportive. Incredible. I still haven't read them all, Brett. They're still nicely filed away at home, but I don't think I could. Maybe one day I'll sit down and read them all. But the one I remember most, which is to your point, is a letter from a bloke in Darwin in the Northern Territory, PO Box, whatever it was. It was on fluoro yellow paper, and it said, "Dear Mr. Ogden, comma, we all make mistakes. That's why pencils have rubbers on the other end. Full stop." And that's it. It's a great letter, isn't it? It's sort of, if I ever write a book, I think it'll be on the front of the book. But it was just a great lesson in life. And he echoed what most people thought. And I would, for the months that followed when I get out of hospital, I couldn't get out of bed. I'd get out of bed, I'd shower, I couldn't put clothes on. I'd put clothes on, I couldn't leave the house. I'd leave the house, couldn't get out of the car. So there was this stage of getting better, they call it a Sawtooth Recovery. And I remember finally getting out just to go walk down the road to buy whatever, just to get out and about. And I say this honestly, Brett, it's a fact. For the entire 12 months that followed me getting back on my feet, every day I was in public, whichever day it was, I would be stopped by somebody in the street who would make me look at them. They'd sort of I couldn't look at people. They'd lift me up to look in their eyes. And they'd say, John, it's great to see you. I'm sorry what happened to you. We all deserve a second chance. Words to that effect. So that as hard as it was in terms of the media, the public feedback was, and empathy and sympathy was extraordinary. And
which is really interesting.
It is. You asked me this question. If you had said to me in the middle of politics, John, you need to be a bit more self-aware. Are you self-aware? I would have said, what's all that Buddhist rubbish of self-awareness? What are you talking about? And I remember after we lost that election in 2003, Barry O'Farrell was my deputy, my friend Barry O'Farrell. And he walked in the door and he said, and it was about a few weeks afterwards, and he said, John, you need to slow down. You're working too hard. You need to slow down. I said, Barry, we need to speed up. I'm going to forget that. No, what do you mean, Barry? No, we've got to work harder.
Yeah.
And I was spinning, right? I had no self-awareness. Lucy and I convinced something was going to happen. I was going to spin off at some stage and hit a wall. So I have spent 15 years doing my very best to become more and more self-aware, to learn what I'm good at, to learn what I'm bad at, to learn what I like, to learn what I don't like. And it's interesting, Brett, we often ask kids, and I fall prey to this, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
Not, what are you good at? What are you bad at?
Yeah.
We try and put them in a box. I want to be a plumber, carpenter, hairdresser.
What gives you So what gives you energy? I say to,
and what gives you a profile? Not what do you like doing? I really like this. Well, why don't you think about doing that? Or I really hate doing this. Or I'm really good at this.
So John, in my first book, I interviewed Ken Doan, the great Australian artist, and I've been, we've got a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, an 8-year-old, and I've said to my wife, I said, Beck, when Ken was 14, his parents knew of his love of painting and that he wanted to be an artist, and they had the courage to take him out of school and put him into art school at, I think, and I must look it up, 14 and 9 months or something.
Wow.
And he became an artist. Now, as parents, whether we have the courage to help our kids identify, in very much in a sort of traditional Christian view, what are the gifts and talents that this person has that they can use to best serve others, rather than, what is the thing that they could do to earn the most money, status, or power? And those two different concepts, I call it the sort of self-sacrifice versus the self-fulfillment gospels. I think are so interesting. And as you reflect on that, that knowing yourself better, and I guess what I would sort of put back to you is that, you reflect on how you were able to really help that gentleman, with his son, expunge his son's criminal record who'd been wrongly charged, or his brother had essentially passed himself off as him, which is so interesting. But the you know, in giving it such a selfish act in the sense where you get so much out of it. But, you know, when you look back now at 50, 51, hopefully you can see that the situation that happened to you and then what you've been able to do post that, which I want to come to and talk about, has really raised people's awareness of mental illness, the pressure that people put on themselves and are often put on, you know, have put on them by others. And, you know, when I was a kid, and you know, I'm 5 years following you at school, people didn't talk about suicide. They certainly didn't talk about, you know, people who had considered killing themselves definitely didn't talk about that as if that was something unreasonable. But we all know that there's 2,200, 2,500 people a year killing themselves in Australia. 3,100, right? So someone's
more than double the number of people who die on the roads.
Right. So so this is very interesting territory. You know, I was 22. I lost my job. I didn't know what to do. I wrote a book interviewing 34 prominent Australians. Off the back of that, I did about 2,000 professional speaking engagements. And consistently, I would have people come up to me and say, Brett, how is it that really bad thing happened to you and you decided to do this? You know, my son killed himself. My daughter killed themselves. How was it that you didn't go that way? There's an absolute epidemic of suicide across our community. If 3,100 people a year are killing themselves in Australia, there must be 100 times that number of people considering it.
Correct. Or attempting. That's exactly right. Thousands.
So it is an absolute epidemic, critical that we talk about it. You know, for me, you know, I've always said to people that, you know, no matter how bad your situation is, if you can just think of somebody who's worse off than you are, which is not, you know, in Australia that would be nine out of 10 people in the whole world, then that's a good place to start, at least as a bit of a mental trick on yourself. But now with your role at Lifeline, what is it that we can share with our listeners, many of whom own private businesses, they're big businesses, they're under a lot of pressure, they put themselves under a lot of pressure. It is, as you said about your big office, often a very thankless task. It's lonely at the top. What have you learned from your work that can most help people to put themselves, I guess, in a better place and help their people?
Brett, right now at this extraordinary time, I mean, there's really no one alive today who's lived through a pandemic, certainly not as an adult. So in this extraordinary time we're in, here's the first lesson. It's okay not to be okay. So you might think to yourself, oh, you know, I'm weak. I'm feeling down. I'm weak, you know. Look, we didn't plan for this time. It happened like that. Lockdowns, I mean, for God's sake, curfews in Victoria. These are almost warlike restrictions on our movement. I'm not making a comment on them, by the way. I'm just saying this has been a warlike
It's very
effort.
Drastic, and I think that's a comment worth, you know, I will make the comment that I think Daniel Andrews needs, you know, actually looks like what you've described. He's working too hard. He's red-eyed. He's stuck in that bubble. He looks unadvised, and he's doing things that affect others. And I think I'm sure over time will prove to have affected himself very poorly. I think his decision making is questionable.
Yeah, well, but it's okay not to be okay.
That's right.
And the other thing is I've experienced, Brett, and I wonder if you have as well, is people who ordinarily do okay through tough times. You know, uncle dies, auntie dies, lose a business, divorce, whatever it might be, you know, a reasonably traumatic event. Some people just are good. They just chuck it. They just, you know, keep on going. Yeah. And a lot of those people in my life are, for the first time ever, feeling real stress and pressure.
Yep.
So first lesson, it's okay not to be okay. The second thing is do not suffer in silence. Yeah. Thank God it's 2020. We live in a world where mental health doesn't have the same shame attached that it used to. We're on a journey in terms of reducing the stigma. We're not all the way there, but awareness has increased entirely. People talk about it publicly. People like me and many, many others talk about their experience publicly.
Yeah.
And it used to be a very generational thing. You know, I used to find older people would have this, what's wrong, get off your ass and go to work, or let's go down to the pub and have a beer. They had this sort of what's wrong with you view about people having mental illness. Now, the greatest growth in suicide numbers in Australia are men over 60. Men over 60. So I think you're finding older people now talking about their own mental health, having love for their kids and their grandchildren who are experiencing poor mental health and episodes and the like. So in this new world we live in, we've had an enlightenment.
Yep.
An enlightenment in the way we think about mental health in Australia over the last 20 years. And thank God we live in Australia, Brett, because there are many other countries around the world where it is literally, for example, still a crime to attempt to commit suicide. Ready for that? Still a crime to attempt to commit suicide. But
now it's interesting.
50 years ago, our faith, the Catholic Church, wouldn't bury you if you'd suicided, wouldn't bury you out of a Catholic church. So we've had a real enlightenment.
So is it progress, John? It's one of the things, controversially, to a degree, if you could say to people that I've had a number of kids at school, commit suicide and using the word as its general term, their behaviour is radically violent towards the people that love them, their parents, their friends, their siblings, and I don't have any doubt that if they could see the aftermath, the damage that they do to other people by that behaviour, that in my mind, in my conception, there's absolutely no doubt that behaviour is criminal, right? In the sense that it is such an appalling thing to do to other people, but judging it doesn't make it better. So it's kind of like, how can you help a person in that situation understand how terrible that behaviour is towards others, while knowing that they're in a position that understanding the impacts and consequences on themselves or others, they're in, I'm not sure what the clinical term is, but probably an impaired way to understand that, but also understand, how to find, I think you were very lucky. You went to that priest. He's obviously called someone and got some people around you.
No, he didn't. It wasn't him. Thank you.
How did it happen?
The police were alerted by journos turned up to the office and police were alerted. But on your point, Brett, I'm aware of stories where the classic young bloke has a screaming fight with mum and dad, tears out of the house, and takes his own life. And I'm aware of stories where the young bloke has survived the suicide attempt and says, I didn't really want to die. I just wanted to make a statement. So it's a very complex thing, suicide. And we should, it's important to normalise mental illness. Yeah. But we really never want to normalise suicide in the sense that make it a normal thing to do. And that's not, I'm not making a religious or moral judgment when I say that. I'm just saying
it's more a community, in terms of the impact on the community.
All of the people around you. And I say, Brett, you're better off alive than dead, right? And also to quote Wham, choose life. Choose life over death. And it's very hard when you're I've been in that very dark place, and I've made a decision that not only the right thing to do, but extraordinarily the best thing to do, because you convince yourself, right? Yeah. Everything goes wrong, and you think to yourself, well, the only way to fix this is to take my own life, and I know what it's like, so I'm not judgmental of it. I just what we just want to get there. This is where Lifeline's really important. Get there at that minute.
So give us a pitch for Lifeline. In your role there, what for our listeners, because I believe, there's a lot of lonely people out there. There's quite a lot of data coming through. What is Lifeline? What's its role, and how can it help people?
Sure. So I'm the chairman of Lifeline, which is a voluntary role, and I've been chairman for the last 8 years and on the board for 10 years. And I'd always respected Lifeline when I was in politics, and when I was leader of the opposition, such was my passion for mental illness, I established the first ever, in this case, a shadow minister. Never before had there been a shadow minister or a minister for mental health in Australia. And ironically, fascinatingly, the person I appointed was Gladys Berejiklian. So I'm always pleased as Premier she's had that grounding of spending time in the mental health sector.
That's very interesting.
Lifeline was formed in 1963 at what we now know as the Wesley Central Mission in Pitt Street. Back then it was the Methodist Central Mission. And the man running it, your older listeners might remember the Reverend Alan Walker, later Sir Alan Walker, who was the sort of the highest profile Protestant churchman in Australia at the time.
Yep, and had a TV. Did he have a radio show?
Yeah, TV show, all that. Yeah, well done.
Yep.
And radio and all that. So Point of View, I think it was called. Anyway, he was a very well-known figure. And in 1961, 2 years earlier, he received a phone call when he was at home. And this bloke said, "Hi, you don't know who I am. My name's Roy, and I'm going to kill myself." And he shared this with Alan Walker. And 2 days later, the police at King's Cross rang Alan Walker and said, "We've just found this body of a dead man with a letter pinned to the chest, to the shirt with your name on it." And to the everlasting gratitude of the people of Australia at that point, Alan Walker said, "We need a lifeline for people who find themselves in this dark position."
Cool.
Now, I just want to go back to the picture, right? So 1963, not everybody had a phone in their own home, and it was still illegal to attempt to commit suicide in New South Wales until 1976. Nobody talked about it. Churches wouldn't bury people, all of that sort of stuff. Back in those days, Brett, you've got to remember, Dad would kill himself and they'd say it was a heart attack.
Yeah.
People would lie about how your loved one died because of the shame attached with suicide. Yeah. So God bless him. Alan Walker starts this service. So we've been running now 57 years. From day one, we've run 24 hours a day. So we've run literally, God only knows how many millions of hours we've run for. We usually take, Brett, 2,500 calls a day. So this time last year, we were taking 2,500 calls a day.
Yeah.
We're now taking, we've set 2 records in the last 6 months, and I don't want to set records when it comes to the number of calls coming to Lifeline. Back at Easter, we got to 3,200 calls, and we hit as high just 2 weeks ago at 3,300 calls. So we are finding half of those people are talking to us about COVID in one way or another, and they're worried about their future. I mean,
and what's the data, John? What's the data of the age of these people? And there's quite a lot of research about essentially an epidemic of loneliness. There's a lot of isolation. Is it?
Yeah, we have always, from day one, and a good number of our callers have always been lonely people.
Yeah. And
the tragedy is, Brett, but at the same time, it's wonderful we're there to take their call.
Yeah.
The tragedy is some people ring us and we're the only voice, other than a radio or television, we're the only voice, the real voice they've talked to and interacted with all week. Yeah. All week. We're the only person they speak to.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of lonely people out there. And the pandemic, I mean, I've been saying for 6 months, every time I hear physical or social distancing, every time I hear the message of stay away from each other, say don't infect and don't leave your house and all sort of stuff, I'm hearing enforced loneliness. So, and often you're lonely because you don't have many friends. You don't have a big work network. You don't engage at sport or local clubs or whatever it might be. So you've got a very small circle.
The post-60 statistic you just mentioned
frightening.
On men is really, a lot of people get their social interaction from work. They get it through their kids' sport, through their kids generally. And you do see a lot of people post-60, even, well-off people materially, don't have many people in their lives.
Our problem as men, Fred, is we do see ourselves through our jobs. So, you're running a really big business one day, every decision, you're making $1 million decisions several times a day. You're in charge of 50, whatever it might be. Your adrenaline's running, you're in charge, and people, you are critical to making decisions. Then you retire or sell the business. And the only question is, what time do I tee off on Wednesday, or when do I have my cappuccino at the cafe?
So it's great.
Prepared ourselves.
Yeah, for meaning. So it really then becomes, a question of meaning. Where do people get their meaning?
Absolutely.
Are they just here to do something, or should they try and be something? And
so my old
that
man
means being something to others.
Yeah, my man was a carpenter for 50 years of his life, from 15 to 65, and a hard worker, never ran his own business. I fib, he did towards the end run his own business, but he worked very hard as a carpenter, very gifted carpenter, by the way, beautiful to watch him work with timber. He retired and he became a volunteer, Brett. So he volunteered for the Olympics, he's volunteered for the Easter show for 20 years in a row, he's volunteered for this, he's volunteered for that. And I said, and he's busier now than when he was.
Yeah.
And his fulfillment in life is, and for him, it's the T-shirts. So you go to his
got all his
you
T-shirts.
open up his cupboard, he's got all the T-shirts, and he's got and he collects them all. So for him, he's volunteering. And I said, do you ever miss work, Dad? You know, do you ever miss work? He said, not for a minute.
Yeah.
And he loved being a carpenter, but he's completely devoted himself to volunteering. And that's not a flash roll, right? It's turning up at a booth and telling which people way to go, or handing out sunscreen, or handing out maps. And for him, he meets people from all over the world, and he's got friends. So that he has filled his life in a way that I just wouldn't have thought of. But it's been brilliant for him. And even as he slows down a bit now at 87, he's still doing a bit of it. But obviously, lockdown's made it hard. But he lives, you know, so this week, 20 years since the Olympics, Lucy took him out for lunch. He put on his Olympic shirt and they went down for fish and chips.
So good.
So for him, and you see other men who retire and have nothing. They do nothing, and they age overnight.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, but there are always things for them to do. There's always a Rotary Club, or there's always mentoring young people. There's a surf club. There's a soccer. I mean, people who need people with that. People who really need people with those skills and experience.
It's amazing. Now, I want to thank John for joining us today. It's been so good to hear of your journey, and you've been so generous in sharing, you know, what I think are very large insights on life and how to move through difficult situations. And I think it's really very special. I want to give a call out for Lifeline 131114 during this time where people are feeling isolated. That's literally a service of where there is someone for you to speak to. And, you know, I guess I'd love to finish on the comment that so often people will tell me, well, you know, I don't need that, and that's good. It's not about you. There might be someone that you know that you might be able to help by knowing of that service. So, John, thank you so much today for joining us on the Be Better Off show, and let's do this again soon.
Terrific. Thanks, mate, and thanks to all of your viewers.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Be Better Off show. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts.
Have a great day.